Hello everyone. This is the next lecture for the course that I teach, advanced methods in biomolecular simulations, and this is continuing with the um, essentially the basic ingredients of free energy method, and then I'll just recap the whole thing in a minute, and taking it to the free energy perturbation method, and giving you more details about it, and and then looking at some exercise that we'll do as a tutorial for this part of the lecture that I gave last hour and this hour together. It would make it to a nice tutorial that that will help you get a better grip on the free energy perturbation method. So what we discussed last class was essentially, let me walk you through the um, uh, things that we covered in a few minutes. So essentially, um, we discussed about the of course the definition of or the equation for the free energy term, and then from there it came out why it is difficult to calculate free energy versus the terms like energy, and we discussed a little bit about um, what are the thermal properties and what are the mechanical properties, right? So we discussed like how when you calculate energy, the less probable terms, though the higher energy terms are very less probable, and so they do not affect the um, average energy as much, because the energy is written as a product of density of probabilities of each of the energy state into the energies. Whereas in the free energy term, you have that in the exponential. The energy term is in the exponential. And as a result, even though the energies are less probable, because the exponential term is a large term, you end up having a significant contribution to the overall free energy average or ensemble average. If you ignore the higher energy terms, then you end up getting erratic free energy. And also we talked about absolute. So I went into the details about partition function and how the temperature. Try to understand it. We try to understand the accessible states, like the uh, the the accessible states through the by looking at how that the q changes when you change the temperatures, or when you have a different density of states, right? And I try to relate it to some of the methods that we should be doing in the coming days. Okay, so we also talked about absolute free energy and relative free energy. So absolute free energy is almost impossible to calculate or measure, and also not extremely, I would say, not worth spending so much of energy and computational time on. Though if you get the analytical functional form for the partition function, everything, all thermodynamic terms fall into place. So we looked at the absolute, and we took a couple of examples like ideal gas, which being non-interactive, all particles identical and indistinguishable. You can write it in a term that is a product of individual partition function, and you end up getting the equation of states and average energies and so on and so forth. And so the idea was that once you can write the partition function in an analytical form, then you can use these thermodynamic equations to extract properties. For example, pressure would be a derivative of free energy with respect to volume and pressure being conjugate terms, and you will end up looking at an equation which SPV is equals to nRT kind of equation. And I asked you to look at a couple of other examples on your own volition by going through some of the StatMech or StatThermo or molecular simulation books. for example, a two-state system, um, and also harmonic oscillators, where you write the Hamiltonian, and based on that, and then you end up writing the partition function from the Hamiltonian. So there is so. So once you know the Hamiltonian, and then the system is simple enough, like non-interacting and so on and so forth, still you could write the uh, overall partition function and extract the certain properties. And in this case, if you have worked it out, you would see how beautifully the equipartition theorem comes out from all this. Okay. So, but in the actual uh, meaningful systems, which are of the physical world, biophysical world, which are of not just academic or theoretical um, value, it would be like extremely difficult to write the partition function in an analytical format, almost impossible, or rather, you don't even attempt it. And so the free energy, relative free energy, is something that is quite useful and doable. So I went through how the relative free energy expression can be written as a ratio of the partition functions of the two phase space, and there are certain subtle things that needs to be kept in mind um, when you're dealing with this. Okay. And so which we'll come to in the coming slides, about the very definition of the free energy. So when you say free energy difference, what are the things that you should keep in mind? So I think I have a slide where I try to warn you all about the pitfalls of getting confused about the very definition of free energy difference, like about the phase spaces, the overlaps of the phase space, the temperatures of the two phase space that you're talking about, and so on and so forth. Okay, so here we try to connect the ratio. So if your system is able to sample the states, let's say state A and state B, in a seamless fashion, then the ratio of the probabilities of that sampling would be equivalent to the ratio of the partition function, and things jumps out very nicely out of here. And we saw that I discussed this, like we took the example, I think, of alanine dipeptide, and said that if you run it for 10 nanoseconds, I mean the whole phi psi, and assuming that phi and psi are your two collective variables, and you would want to see if you are able to get the Ramachandran map, and you should be able to. So in that case, you don't have to bias the system. The system actually manifests is the barriers are small enough that you are able to sample the different states, and things becomes very easy. Just by counting the occurrences of those states, you can actually tell the free energy between the two states. Okay. And then, but that is, it's not always simple. Not all systems are like alanine dipeptide, or or a particle moving in a thermal motion around the um, um, in solution, or having smaller barriers. So what happens most of the times is that so this is a quite a common thing that we know, and a major limitation is that things get locked into the local minima, and then to jump out of it, sometimes you're able to jump out it through thermal jumps, but many a times may have to drive the system out of it, right? And so what happens is that, suppose you are in a, so this is a reaction coordinate, let's say A and B are the two states, and you have defined a reaction coordinate that can clearly separate the two states. And then if you start with A, the reality is that it just stays in the A basin. If you start with B, stays in the B basin. And so sampling becomes a major issue. And so you just can't count and say that, okay, this is the ratio of the uh, probabilities or the occurrences, and hence the free energy difference between the two systems is this. Because suppose you start with A, then then you have all states which are A and none of the states which are B, and so the ratios are, and maybe once in a while you get some other intermediate states, so the ratios are not realistic. So one of the major focus and expenditure of resources and intelligence and computational resources is on, and also ideas, is on trying to try to drive the sample um, out of the basin that it likes to go to. So essentially, a sort of a non-Boltzmann sampling, and then trying to extract out the actual Boltzmann probabilities of the system. We will go into these things in the coming days when I'm talking about, particularly um, about weighted histograms and umbrella sampling and multi-stage histograms and so on and so forth. But for now, just know that once sampling is a major issue in systems that are more physical, more realistic, larger, um, having a lot of cooperative components. And the other thing that is also important, and which I stressed upon, was that even if you are in a basin and you feel that you may not be actually be able to sample, this is particularly true for large systems. You may not be actually you may not be fully sampling that state itself. Forget about sampling between the two states. Just the first one state itself, the sampling may be actually erratic. And an example I gave was, for example, you have a butane molecule, let's say, which is actually in butane, you would quickly see the sampling in a few nanoseconds. But imagine that this was a really complex protein, and you have defined a reaction coordinate or a collective variable to define a state in a certain way. And so you can see, like, for the same configuration of the molecule, there are many different ways in which water molecules are arranging around it, right? In some cases, you may have all the water molecules hydrogens facing. In some cases, you may have oxygens facing. And you can know that the overall energy of the system or the energies that you are concerned about would be actually quite different in the cases. And then you would like to sample the right populations of all the different configurations for the same conformation of the protein. And this is where uh, because the free energy and the free energy difference and the energy difference between the two states are profoundly connected, which is the topic of our discussion today, through and which we will discuss through the exponential averaging, or the what is called a free energy perturbation theory, generally credited to one of the legends in the StatMech area, Robert Zwanzig. Um, and so I'll talk about that in greater details about how the connection. So one thing here that you have to be careful about is, even at the same state, the sampling has to be has to be complete, and you cannot just take a snapshot of this and say that, okay, this is the confirmation I found, so let's move on to the next angle and next angle, because at that state itself you need to have a decent sampling, or a complete sampling, so to speak. Okay, and so these are the two things that needs to be taken care of when. So um, so one of the examples that we will do is, and not in the free energy perturbation part of the lecture, but in the next set of lectures that I will be presenting to you, which is the umbrella sampling and weighted histogram analysis method, and also Benedict extension ratio kind of. So once we have the trajectory, we can use multiple methods to find the potential of mean force. I did talk about the potential of mean force in the past. So we'll take sodium and chloride in water and move it and generate trajectories at different distances, and then try to find how the dissociation energy or the dissociation free energy changes with the distance, and then look for something that is non-obvious. Like, you would assume that the sodium and chloride, there must be a minimum where they may like, and then after that it is all essentially down uphill from there. But that's not the case. You will see that it's a very interesting feature that pops up, where there's another minima which is stabilized by a water wire. Okay, and to me that was very, very interesting to bring it to the class, and that is something that we'll do in the coming weeks. Okay, so through that I will try to also highlight the aspects of how to properly do umbrella sampling and weighted histogram method analysis, and just the histogram method. Thinking about that will help. So this brings me to the end of the last lecture. So what we talked about was the requirement of a Hamiltonian that you can trust, and I said that this is not a lecture or a class or a course where um, we are discussing about the uh, this is not about the development of force fields, but that's a major and important area of research, and there are lots of labs and people who have contributed to this and are still in the contributing, and so we'll just assume that the force fields that we are taking are good enough, and go from there. Then of course I talked about the sampling and what are the different ways in which so over the period of next few weeks you will learn about different ways in which people drive the system out of their equilibrium. And and then we talked about we'll talk about the unbiasing aspects of these things also, because if you take if you bias all the configuration, let's say at the same for the same times scale, like let's say you take butane, our favorite example, for example, or alanine dipeptide, and you take psi angle or one of these dihedral angle, and you simulate 0 degree at, let's say, 5 nanoseconds, 1 degree at 5 nanoseconds, 2 degrees at 5 nanoseconds, and so on and so forth. So all the 180 or 360 degrees you have simulated 180, let's say, at equal time. So you have equal sampling of all of them, right? So does it mean that all states are equally likely? That's not the case, right? So there is an unbiasing aspect that has to take place, and that there also the energy aspects comes into play. So it is important to understand how the energy, free energy difference and the energy difference are connected for the different states that we have, and that is the main topic of discussion for us today. Okay, so so let me get straight to it. So what we are going to do is try to understand this from the um, so the first thing that um, we have to think is, imagine that you are created an in some you have created a system where you decided to sample at a given state, let's say state I, and I'll just take a minute to make this point more clear, or rather um, so the way to so okay maybe I need to take a step back and actually start with an example. So let's see if I can, yeah, okay, so maybe we can start from here. So imagine that you are in a state I. Okay, so you have set up your simulation box where let's say you have uh, yeah, you take any example, like imagine you take, it could be a you take a, again you can take, let's say, sodium chloride or a molecule like this with 0 degree as a as the state that you are sampling, right? So you have put your butane, you have surrounded it by water, or you have taken sodium chloride at a certain distance and surrounded it by water, and that is the distance. So we'll call that state as I. Okay, so let's take the example of sodium chloride too, because the figures are mostly drawn in the sodium chloride, this figure that you see here. So imagine that you have two particles, sodium and chloride, at a distance di. Okay, in a box solvated with water, and you are asking the question that I want to simulate the whole thing as a di, and I want to find, and because this, as you have this as di, they are moving about, so there is another distance that it can sample, which is a dj distance, right? And so you say that, okay, I won't pin the sodium chloride at dj distance, but what I'll do is I'll take I'll look at the energies. I will sample the sodium chloride at this distance, and then I will look for the configurations that pop up at j distance. Okay, and then um, can I write the free energy difference between the two states like that? Another example that you can think of is which is an example that is in the Andrew Leach's book, and that is not a, so here the collective variable or the reaction coordinate is a physical reaction coordinate. There it's a more achemical, in the sense that you take, so another example you can think of is, let's say you take a butane ethanol. Okay, and so ethanol would have a, so this is an example you take, right? and you surround it by water, put it in a solvation box, and you run the simulations for whatever time that you think is good enough, and the more the better. And then you ask the question that so I want to find out the free energy difference um, between ethanol and ethane thiol, so which is the so replacing the um, here with a sulfur, let's say, right? And so what you do is you simulate your whole system in with ethanol, and then you keeping the ethanol at the place there. You have for every snapshot you find the energy that which is there with the configuration, so the configuration stays the same of everything of particles around it, and um, and from there you actually start calculating the difference between the two energies, okay, so you assume that there is another so for the same configuration that you have, you find the energy of the system as if ethane thiol was present, okay, and so there will be energy difference between the two, correct? So you have ethanol, you have water surrounding it. Let's say the water is surrounded in a certain way, you have that snapshot. You find the energy of the system with ethanol and the water surrounded for the same for the coordinates that you have. Now for the same coordinates of the water and the rest of the ethanol, you assume that the oxygen is replaced with the sulfur, and you calculate the EJ with the same configuration. You're not doing another simulation. And so the difference in the energy that you end up would be the energy that you are considering as the difference of the two energies, okay? And so once you do that, um, you you so if and this is something that is quite important, because you are running just one set of simulations and then finding assuming that, or rather finding the free and the energy difference of a state that you are replacing the current molecule with, in the case of ethanol. And in another case, what you're doing is you are um, keeping all the coordinates and the phase space same. You are essentially finding the Hamiltonian for the or the energy for the other state that you are working with, right? And so one thing that is important is that overlap between the two states. So naturally, I mean, if you have, for example, if sodium and in the example of sodium and chloride, if you are at a distance, let's say 5 angstrom, and you so this is something that is actually what I'm going to say. You have to pay some attention here. So how good is this method, in the sense that, see, I can take it at 5 angstrom and then ask the question, what is the free energy difference between sodium and chloride at 5 angstrom and 10 angstrom, right? And so this is a 5 angstrom difference that I'm talking about. Now, when you have sodium and chloride at 5 angstrom and your water surrounding it, so you're locking that trajectory up, right? You say that all the coordinates of the water I'm keeping, I find the energy EI of sodium and chloride at 5 angstrom, and then you say that, okay, everything freezes, and I simply move the sodium and chloride to 10 angstrom and find the energy EJ, and then try to find the difference between them, and we'll use that to calculate the average, the free energy that comes into being. So what is the problem here is that the EJ is far removed from EI. At no point, it's highly unlikely that if you are sampling at 5 angstrom, you would actually run into a configuration for a 10 angstrom sodium and chloride separation, right? But it is more likely that, let's say, you are running at 5 angstrom and sodium and chloride at 5.5 angstrom or 6 angstrom will see the same water environment. It is more likely to happen. So if there is no overlap between the two, then you are actually sampling. You are claiming to sample a phase space that actually is not being visited by the referenced simulation that you are doing, right? And this is a major flaw or rather I would not say a limitation, but something that needs to be careful about. So you only sample in very close proximity. So the reaction coordinate that you define, or the collective variable that you're defining, you need to sample in a very close um, in an ensemble or a configuration that is also likely to be visited by the other state that you are not simulating. Okay, I hope this is a bit confusing. I hope this becomes clear as I go along and actually take some example. For example, let's take the other example, right? You have a molecule like this. You decide to simulate. You take this molecule, you let it fluctuate a little bit, and maybe as much as the force field allows, and you simulate this, let's say in water or in a non-polar polar solvent, and you ask the question like, what is the free energy um, of phi or dihedral angle being in this position, and let's say a slightly rotated position. That is one. That is one set of question that you ask. The other set of questions that you ask through free energy perturbation is, I take this configuration, or instead of, because I have not come to the free energy perturbation theory, let's say you're trying to find the free energy energy difference between the two. So you are at this state, and you're saying that I will simulate at this configuration, but I want to find the energy difference between these two. And now you are making a claim that I will run the simulation at this, find the EI, which will be the accurate, and then I'll simply move the sodium, my molecule, to like this, keep all the environmental molecules where they are, and then calculate the energy difference. This would be erratic because the configuration that is seen by the water or the non-polar molecules that are around this butane molecule is totally impractical. They would never visit that. But it is likely that if you are simulating at this, and let's say there's a certain arrangement of water molecules around it, and you slightly move it by a certain angle, then the same water arrangement of water molecules or the same configuration would be likely to be visited by this closely proximal state, and that would be the region which would be overlapping region here, right? And so the overlap regions becomes very important in this case, because the claim is that so what you are doing is you are sampling this thing, right? And you are claiming to find the energy of a state um, J, right? So if there is no overlap, so what the essentially what you are assuming is that there is a region that actually the whole configuration state would be visited by the simulation if I were doing a simulation with J2. But if that is not the case, things fall out of place. That is very, very important. And I'm going to make it even more, go over this more, because I don't think I'm doing a great job of explaining this right now, but I hope with the examples it will become more clear. So let me first actually go through the theoretical aspects of, or the equations that come about, and maybe then I can again come back to this example, right? So we all know that the free energy difference can be written as a term here. This is a simple algebra where you write Fi is equals to minus beta of ln qi, and you take a difference, and because these are logarithmic terms, you get a ratio of it. And when you get a ratio of it, you end up a term like this. So we'll do some algebra here and come to the fundamental equation of how the delta Fij is connected to the difference in the two states. Okay, and because the difference in the two and energy is easy to calculate, but there are certain caveats which you have to be careful about. So the system is set up such that you can simulate the system in a state I, and you make a claim that the system, there will be states that will be visited by the system, which the state J will also visit. Okay, and that is something very, very interesting. And I'll talk. I'll talk. And I mean, there are papers and in fact many nice articles and books written on this, and so something to think about more clearly. Okay, about how would you expect these differences to be. So, but let's first go through this the formal derivation of this. So you write delta Fij is equals to this term, and then you can what you do is you say that, okay, now I will not do any operation on the QI. The QI is my reference state. Remember, you are only simulating the QR. You are simulating the ith state. You're not simulating a J state. You're just making an assumption that there are configurations, that there are energy difference. So you are going to calculate um, the energy of the as if the system was in the J state too. Okay, and so then you write the equation such that you add EI and subtract EI. So this is like adding 0 to the whole term here, and then you rewrite in terms of exponential of beta EI and minus exponential of the difference between the two energies. And because this is an exponential powers, you can put it as a product. And once you put it as a product, because QI for the reference state, you can assume it to be a constant for the reference that you're talking about. So the whole thing can be written as minus beta inverse log of sigma pi and exponential of minus beta delta Eij, where delta Eij is the difference in the energies calculated um, at the state I, assuming that the state J is also well sampled. Okay, and so now you know that this is just an average, right? So this would be an ensemble average. PIXI, sigma of PIXI is an average term. So you end up, you write a bracket, ensemble bracket, and this is a very important part. You write I here because see the references with respect to the probability distribution that you are having is at the with the state reference I, correct? So this is something that you should not forget because many people tend to forget that all the calculations are being done with the configurations that are generated at the reference I, okay, or the state I. So and then you do some algebra and basically multiply with beta term and take an exponential on both ends, and you end up with this very, very important, one of the most important free energy equation called, you can call it an exponential averaging, a free energy perturbation equation that connects the free energy difference between the state I and J with the energy difference between the state I and J. Okay, and note the exponential term here and the I term here, right? So it's not just one state. You cannot just take one state, one snapshot, get the delta E, and say that that is the free energy difference, because that's not the case. What happens is that there are many difference. Like I said, for the same configuration, there are many different configurations of water molecule around, right? So imagine that you have an I like this and a J like this, and suppose we are able J like this. Okay, so let's say you have 0 degree I diagonal and let's say 5 degree diagonal, and these are the two states you are talking about. So so what you are doing, so there is a set of water molecules that will be here for this this angle, and you take the same set configurations and you simply calculate the energy of the states that are J, and but that's not enough, because then there are other configuration for the same I, right? And so you need to do this for all sets of configurations, and that is why there's an ensemble average. Okay, and because you are only running the simulations or sampling at I states, you have this subscript I, which is basically saying that sampling at. So these are the two things that you should be very, very clear about. This and the thermodynamic integration gets very nicely connected to the Jarzynski inequality. But because I'm not teaching non-equilibrium aspects of the free energy calculation, I may not go into the details of it, but it is possible that when we meet again, I will try to. So the Jarzynski equation, the free energy perturbation and thermodynamic integrations can be shown to be special cases of that. Okay, but there we talk in terms of the work done, not in terms of the free energy, because these are equilibrium simulations and equilibrium calculations. Um, the work done and the free energies are the same, right? Because that is how the free energy is defined. Free energy is the energy available to do work. But then if you do things where in a non-equilibrium fashion, they are not always the same. You always do less work than the free energy in a non-equilibrium, less or less than equal to work. And so there's some beautiful actually article by Chipote and co-workers on Chris Chipote and co-workers on best practices in free energy methods. Maybe I'll share that paper with you, where they go into this aspect. But this is for some another day. Okay. So the takeaway from all the things that I've spoken so far is that um, you keep the confirmation you do the simulation at one state, you call it I, let's say, then you explore, so you find the energy of the state that you care about and the state that the other state that you are trying to find the energy difference with, and you find the delta E for that, delta Eij, and you do this over and over and over again for the for the good sampling that you can get, and if you have good overlaps between the two, then you would actually end up having a sensible free energy difference. Now, what happens is, so let's go back to this one, right? So if you, so so imagine that you are in a collective variable space here, right? What happens is, what happens to the value of, so of course the j is too far removed from the I, right? And so in that case, what happens, the energy terms, the delta Eij is quite, um, is out of the overlap region, and that has an effect on the exponential averaging in a certain way. So when you run the examples that we have for the tutorial, things will become more clear to you, and that is why we are doing. So we end up with a equation that you should be remembering, and more than remembering, should be able to understand how it came into being, and that connects the free energy with the average, free energy difference with the energy difference, where the energy difference is not just for one snapshot, uh, but an ensemble average sampled at state I. So this you should keep in mind, and some of the examples that could be, so has been, so there's this example is from Andrew Leach's book, where you take ethanol and you simulate an ethanol in, let's say, water, and you ask the question like, what is the delta G of between ethanol, free energy difference between ethanol and ethane thiol, um, and you simulate it with ethanol, and you find the energy at each of the times. So let's say you run into 100,000 steps, right? 100,000 steps you sampled, which means that, let's say, you're sampling at every thousand, every picosecond or every 2 picoseconds. Suppose you're dumping your trajectory. So you dump your trajectory. In that trajectory, what do you get? And so let's say you dump it, you get 100,000 steps or 1 million steps, let's say. So what happens is that for the 1 million steps, each step will have an ethanol molecule and will have water around it, correct? And so what you do, you find 1 million energies, correct? You can calculate that energy. So you will have one table set that is 1 million energies, E1, E2, E3 for ethanol going to E1 million. Then this is what you do. You close your eyes and you say, I'm going to replace the ethanol molecule with ethane thiol, okay? And then I will just assume that ethanol is replaced with ethane thiol, and I will see like how the energy changes. So you create another column, and in that column you say, calculate the energy as if it was ethaniol, okay? And so what happens, the energies will not be the same, of course, because the interaction between the ethane molecule and ethaniol molecule, um, ethanol and ethaniol with the water interaction energies are different, right? There will be more. And so you use that force field to create another column of 1 million energies. And so for each step, each row, you have an energy difference, right? That is the delta Eij. And you have 1 million delta Eijs, and all you do is now say that, okay, I'm going to take an ensemble average of exponential of minus beta delta Eij for the 1 million, and that average will be equal to the free energy difference. Now, this is exactly what you do for the free energy perturbation. For example, suppose you're asking the question, what is the free energy difference between putting, let's say, a benzene in water versus a phenol molecule in water, right? Yeah. So again, you run your simulations for whatever time you want. Create a column where you find the energy EIs, or with the reference energy of benzene, and with all the water around it, the configuration, 1 million steps, you have one column. Then you assume that benzene is now converted into phenol, right? And so you do not change any coordinates, you just take the same simulation, except that now you are calculating the energies, assuming that the benzene has become a phenol, right? And there are some things that you guys must be thinking right away, which I'll come to in a minute, about steric hindrances and so on and so forth. And this is something that you can only learn when you actually start doing things. There are other aspects of it, like slow growth and thermodynamic integration, in the next lecture I'm going to talk about. But just imagine that you run benzene simulation, you create a column, you are able to get 1 million energies, then you just close your eyes, say that, okay, the benzene is now phenol, and now I will calculate the energy as if it was phenol, right? So you can imagine immediately the interactions change, right? Now there's an oxygen, so the electrostatic interactions become important for the same coordinates of water around it, right? So you will get some energies. Now, for each row, you take the difference between the two states. You have 1 million energy differences, and so you take an exponential average of it, and that will give you delta F of, or delta G, whatever you want to call it. There's a subtle difference between, not subtle, but there's difference between F and G, but for all practical purpose, because we are running NVT, we'll call it F. But since the systems are volume conserving, it is equally good to call them delta G. And so you get the energy difference, and from there you are able to calculate. Now there are certain issues, right, which you're already thinking about. You're thinking, okay, there was a hydrogen, and now I'm replacing the hydrogen with the OH group. So it is larger, it has a more exploded volume. So what happens to steric classes and so on and so forth. So those are some things that are actually has to be taken care of when you're running free energy perturbation method. You cannot have things that are too crazy with respect to each other. It has to be very slow. And so people actually will take a lot of intermediates in between and do it as if more unrealistic intermediates, and then connect one to the other, second to the other. And that is the example that you will run in the class. Okay. So again, I hope how from a given simulation, how can you calculate delta F of the two states, as long as you are not overly ambitious or nuts about the next state. Like if the states are very close to each other, if the jumps in the energies are enough so that the other, so there's an enough overlap, I think it's a decent method and very elegant for such kind of calculations where you're doing a chemical transformation. Also for solvation and other things. So the example that we will run in the class is we will ask the question, if you have an uncharged particle in a water molecule, like this, let's say this blue one is a uncharged particle, and you do the simulation like that, right? You take a particle in a box and you just run it with water around it. It will float like a Brownian particle all around. And then you create a column, you calculate the energy of the system. Then you say, okay, I'll close my eyes and I'll say that it has a charge of 1, okay, +1. Now, the moment you, but the trajectory is the same. So the moment you put a 1 charge, all the interactions are changed, right? Now you have an electrostatic interaction with the water molecule. So you create another column with all the energies, and you take the difference between the two, and you should be able to get a free energy difference of charging a particle in water. Easier said than done, because the jump from an uncharged to a fully charged one, unit ESU, is a big jump, right? And so what we will be doing is we will be taking small jumps so that this and this, so this is zero, let's say this is the zero charge state and this is the one charge state. This is a large jump and there's no overlap. So what water configuration a zero charge is sampling will likely not be sampled by a fully charged ion. So and you will see that you will get wrong delta G's. So what we will do is that we will take, say, okay, we will have a zero charge simulation. Then we will assume that it is 0.1 ESU, okay, and the assumption, and then calculate the delta EIJ. And the assumption here is that the water conformations that is being sampled by zero charge, like an uncharged particle, and one that is partially charged, point E, 1 E, there are certain water configurations that this guy will also see, okay? And so this is how you do, you connect all of them, and because this is a state variable, delta G, you can just add them up and get it. And so this is the exercise that I want all of you to do as a tutorial for this set of lectures. So I was hoping to do the thermodynamic integration in the next lecture. And so I'd ask you guys to do, half of you to do a thermodynamic integration for the same things and free energy perturbation for half of you, okay? Okay, so I hope by now things are more clear about free energy perturbation and how it is done. A few things will become more clear when you do the exercise, and you don't have to worry about generating these trajectories. Actually, I have these trajectories where I have simulation of uncharged particle with a certain exploded volume in water and then at different charges, okay? And so we'll do it that way. Okay, so now let's go back to things. So the thing that I started this today's lecture with was, what are the things that you need to worry about in terms of being true to the definition of free energy difference, right? And so, of course, we discussed about relative and absolute free energy difference. And it's rarely you would want to actually calculate absolute free energy. Even when people say they are calculating absolute free energy, it is with reference to a zero, some reference state, okay? And for all practical purposes, for the things that we care about, relative free energy is good enough. And so that is something that that you should keep in mind whenever you are thinking about the free energy, because free energy difference will tell you a lot of things about how the system is behaving, driving forces, more stable state versus less stable states, and so on and so forth. The second thing that people sometimes, students who are new to this, make a mistake is about the writing, considering the two states at different temperatures, okay? And then what happens, the free, so you have F1, let's say Fi is equals to minus KT log of Q1I, KTI or KT1, and the other is minus KT2 log of Q2. And so you have two different temperatures. The moment you do this, you simply cannot take the ratio between the two states, right? Because you have to take KT out of the things. And so it's not just the ratio of the partition function anymore. And remember what we discussed about the ratio of the probabilities that are wasted is equivalent to the ratio of the partition function. That falls apart, correct? So you can't have phase spaces at two different temperatures. If you want to do simulations at two different temperatures, there are other ways of doing it, okay? You may want to sample it in a way that, so we will talk about that. There are places where you would want to find energy difference, free energy difference at different temperatures, but to write free energy or to think of free energy difference in this way is erratic, okay? So please avoid doing that. And the third is the phase space overlap, which is, I think, something that is also, you will appreciate when you actually do the exercise. I'll show you, if you take zero charge and the next simulation, and then with the reference as a zero charge, you right away want to find out what is the free energy difference of charging the particle one. there are no overlap or hardly any overlaps between the two states, zero charge and one state, for the configurations of water around it. And we will see that we get a delta G that is far removed from the uh, 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 experimentally measured delta G, and also some of the very seminal paper work done by a lot of people like Gerhard Hammers and others, where they have actually calculated the delta G for the same example that we're doing using thermodynamic integration and Monte Carlo method. So you see how different they are, and that is why you need all these overlaps. Okay, and this is something that I'm again and again putting it into your mind, is that the configuration of the water in this particular example around it, when you have a slight change in the charges, let's say, then the other charge, for the same set of simulations, for the same coordinates, the other charge also is possibly capable of seeing those configurations of water, which may not be the case when you charge it far away. A good example is in actually, I'll come to that. There are a few good other examples that I should be talking about towards the end of the lecture. So let's see. And this is not just, it's applicable to many places. Like a lot of people use free energy perturbation to look at ligand binding. The problem is that anytime you have a large free energy difference between the two states, you need to break it up into many small steps. Okay, so most of the time people will combine free energy perturbation with some other methods, which I will be talking about in the coming weeks. For example, there's a nice paper by Benoit Roux where they have connected umbrella sampling with free energy perturbation method. I know Bruce Burns' lab does, and Schrodinger also uses free energy perturbation with replica exchange and a few other methods. Then there is a thermodynamic integration coupled to umbrella sampling. And so there are many, so you combine multiple methods. And I think as you get along the course, you will learn more about those aspects. So, so at the start of the course, I don't know if I told you, but there are essentially 3 different categories of free energy calculation. One is counting or histogram based method, which I will cover in the coming weeks when I'm talking about all the classical works of John Vallu and Swenson and Ferenberg and others, going all the way back to the 50s, in fact, late 60s, early 70s work of these guys, and then coming to some of the seminal paper by Kumar and others on umbrella sampling, and then later on weighted histogram and Bennett acceptance ratio. And so we'll do the histogram methods after we do the perturbation method, which we are doing now. And then I'll also talk about the what is called thermodynamic integration, where you, instead of calculating the you actually take the derivatives of the free energy. So there's some advantages of that, but there are also some disadvantages of it. So by the way, I don't know if many of you know, but actually Robert Zwanzig, who is credited with the free energy perturbation method, though there are examples of Lev Landau and even John Kirkwood kind of using it implicitly in their formulations, but it was Zwanzig who actually brought it out in a very refined manner. Is actually a PhD student of, I think, John Kirkwood. So it's like apple not falling far away from the tree kind of example here. Both of them are one of my favorite, few of the favorite physical chemists that I like to follow quite. Follow their work. Okay, so just let me reiterate the things that I have talked to you, which is essentially in the interest of time, because I think in another 15 minutes it will be an hour lecture already. So it's funny how things flies, and I always hope that I can finish this part like only 10-12 slides in an hour, but that's not happening. And I can't rush it through because these are connected to the tutorials that you've been doing, and because this is all online, it's kind of, hopefully this will work out. You guys will be able to do your tutorials properly, because that's the whole point, to be able to run these simulations and to really conceptually understand this at the practical level. Okay, so the example that I'll run is, so remember the generalized bond solvation model I was talking about in one of those classes, where you are trying to find out what is the free energy of taking a charged particle, and inserting it in water, right? And so you are asking, like, what is the energy of free energy of solvation, and there are multiple aspects of solvation. There is an electrostatic aspect. There's also a non-polar aspect. Okay, the non-polar aspect is actually quite complex, because it has the aspects of hydrophobic interactions and the rearrangements of water molecules and everything around it. So let me break it down for you in two parts. Okay, so what happens is, because this is the state variable delta G, what you do is you break it into three different parts, right? Which is one after the other. So you discharge the system in vacuum, and that is very easy to calculate. It is just because there is no entropic aspects coming into play in discharging, and it's just vacuum. There are no other configurations for the same same change that you make. So it's a very straightforward calculation. It's just electrostatics interaction. The second one is where the non-solvation, the non-polar aspects of that comes, and we are not going to do that exercise. That's quite complex. I mean, if somebody wants to take it up as a project, feel free to do so, but we are not doing that. So the other aspect is, you take this particle and you insert it in water. Okay. Now it's easier said than done, because when you take the particle and insert it in water, you need to create a cavity, right? And the creation of the cavity means that you need to push out water. And imagine sampling that. So the way people do it is that they will put a zero volume or a zero radius particle, and then slowly increase it. Okay, increase the size. And so you can think of breaking the whole thing into multiple simulations, where you start with, let's say, 0.1 sigma, and then calculate the delta, the free energy difference of 0 and 0.1 sigma. And then you simulate 0.2 sigma, and then because the water is around and all the RDFs and other things will change, you calculate the delta G from the delta U that you can get. And like that, you go all the way to sigma, right? And so you have a lot of delta Gs from delta G1, delta G2, delta G3 to delta Gn, which is basically from 0 to 0.1 sigma, 0.1 sigma to 0.2 sigma, and like so on and so forth. And so you add them up, and you get a free energy. And so what happens is that every time you change a sigma, the water solvation around it changes, the RDF changes, the configuration changes, and it requires a lot of sampling and averaging, and so but that will give you the non-polar part of the free energy of the solvation. What we will be doing is the polar part. So if you have an uncharged particle and you charge it up to 1 ESU or 1 Q, then what is the delta G? Okay, so we are going to calculate delta G3 for the tutorials that we are going to do. Okay, and by the time you do the tutorial, I think you will be a Paka expert in free energy perturbation. At this point of time, I would like you to bring attention to a really awesome website that you guys can frequent as a free energy simulators. I think this is maintained by Professor Chodera and a few others of his friends and colleagues. Unfortunate that it's not getting updated quite frequently, and maybe some of you or even I can get involved and update these things. I mean, I think this is, you can put a request and try to make some changes. So I tried to see the last change. It was actually in 2016, but the good thing is that there are changes in fact, there was a change till last two days back, where you could see job postings in the free energy calculation method. So if you're looking for a job, this is also a good place to go, because let me see if I can open this. Yeah, I can. I think I'm connected to the internet here, so I'll open it up and show you. So this is a good web page, or rather a website to follow. Okay, and very elegantly and beautifully written sections that you can follow up, and it tells you, it has it gives you, of course, the basics of the methods, but also then it tells you how the different tutorials, best practices, and so on and so forth. And And so maybe I can tell you like a few of those. So let me open this one. So I urge you guys to go and take a look at this website. Okay. There is another website or a tool that I will introduce you to you guys in the coming days is on something called Plume. If some of you are not familiar with it, it's also like a really nice consortium of scientists who care a lot about doing very thorough and reproducible free energy calculations in physical chemistry and biophysical field. And so that is something that is also a good tool to have, which I'll discuss in some coming weeks. So let's see what else here. Okay. So I'll just walk you guys through because we have about 10-15 minutes. I can take more. So if you go to this website, the website will pop up on my, I think it's not popping up. So let me just, I'll yeah, I think it popped up behind the screen. Okay. So I hope you are able to see this. So you can go to best practices. In fact, there's a nice article, best practices in free energy calculation. Uh, okay. Um, just take a look at this. Like, what are the things that you should be thinking about when you're talking about or doing free energy calculations? What are the things that you should be not doing? Things that you should be particularly paying attention to, and about the trigger and like looking at standard deviation, doing multiple runs, convergences, things like that. But to immediately to you, what would be important is to look at the tutorials and a very nice set of tutorials by people in the field, like Justin Lemkul, whose GrowMax tutorial I think you follow to run lysozyme, has a nice tutorial on how to compute ethanol solvation free energy, standard free energy calculation. And there's the Amber tutorial on lysozyme. Then there are some NAMD tutorials on trying to take a protein and finding the free energy of mutating that residue to something, one of the residues to something else. Um, a, a, a gold mine of resources here. So urge you to go and take a look at it because these will be required. There is nothing in lamps, but the charms, uh, so I have um, the sodium example that I was giving, like taking an uncharged particle and charging it to 1 ESU in lamps. And so you have the fifth software for you there, right there. Okay. So go and take a look at this website and browse through it, try to learn more from it. Okay. Now I'll come back to my tutorial because that's what I care a lot about. And I want you guys to um, this. So this is a paper. So what I already explained to you what we are doing and what I'll be providing you. I'll be providing you multiple trajectories of a particle in a box, but the particles will have different charges. Okay, so you will have one set of trajectories with 0 charge, another set of trajectories with 0.1 E charge, and so on until one ESU charge. Okay, and so we are going to calculate between two consecutive trajectories, the delta UQ, right? And then find the delta 1, 1, 2, then 0, 1, 0, 2, sorry, 0, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, and then connect all of them, and in the end we will get from 1 to n. So we will get the delta G of charging it from 0 to 1. Okay? And so, so I'll give you those trajectories, so you don't have to worry about generating them in the because of this lockdown and other things. I don't expect you guys to run bunch of trajectories, and thankfully I have these trajectories from one of the past tutorials that or rather a project that was submitted to me as a part of the work in the previous years. Uh, and to see that if you're on the right track, I'm also sharing with you a paper by Gerard Hummer, on Gerhard Hammer on free energy of ionic hydration. Do read this paper, okay? And very clearly it comes. It's a very thorough work done where and they have compared with papers, experimental data of Friedman and Krishnan. I tried to pull out this paper by Friedman and Krishnan. It's a huge paper. I think more than 50 pages big. I didn't end up reading it. It's just too big. But I will trust this and say that if you take result of calculating free energy of ionic hydration, see, he's saying ionic hydration. So the hydration has two parts, right? The non-polar part and the charging part. So we are talking about the charging part here. And so, so you can calculate the free energy. It comes out to over 371, 372. These are ABCDs are different methods of doing it. I think the C is the experimental method by Friedman and Krishnan, and D is the experimental method by Conway. Some of you may know of that legend. And then there's some other other simulation methods also, like one by Professor Bernstein and Stratzman, which is, I think, yeah, B. So I'm going to ask, are we falling in this ballpark, okay, from the methods that we are working with? And so that's the idea. So what happens is, so I'll give you these things, right? And then of course what happens is that at every charge, the water around it starts changing configuration in certain ways, and then you will see how it manifests in the energy calculation. And so what we are going to do, and this is why I'm going to give you a set of trajectories, because this Q0 and QE is equals to E are far separated apart. So the water configuration that you sample, or the configurations that you sample at zero charge, highly unlikely that you will sample the same configurations at charging. And you can do this exercise very easily. So what you do, you take a particle in a box, uncharged particle, run an empty simulation of it, and let's say find the G of R of water molecules as well as G of R between the particle and the water molecule. And now you do another simulations at charge Q, like putting the particle fully charged. It's another matter to have a solvation box which is effectively charged, but that's a discussion for another day. And the prerequisite of MD, I'm taking refuse in that. But if you simulate with Q is equals to E and look at the radial distribution function, or the way the of the water molecules between themselves and the ion and the water molecules, you see a difference in them. And so they're sampling different, but are there overlaps? And you see that there are very few overlaps. And so what we are going to do is we are going to run a bunch of simulations I'm going to provide you, and look at the free energy difference between, let's say, 0 and 0 0.1, 0.1 and 0.2, like this, and then just add them up, and we'll end up with a value that is 362 kilojoules per mole is what we got last time. And if you go the other way around, like you start from one charge and go down, you end up with 360 kilojoules, and this is roughly in the ballpark of what we see here, right? The data that you are seeing in the the paper by Hammer. And see, this is the funny part. If you actually just take 0 and do and say that, okay, now I'll be lazy and I'll not think about the rigor and I'll not think about overlaps, and I'll simply say that these are the configurations also being sampled by the fully charged particle, then you end up with a free energy difference of 184.97, and that is quite far removed from almost half, actually, from 362, right? And so you can see like how much the overlap and doing the rigorous sampling matters here. This is another thing that we do. So to see like how good we are doing, say between 0.9 and 1, like within the 1.1 change that you are making every trajectory, are you doing a good job? Is it a good estimate, or you need to even further make stratification between 0.9 and 1? So if you do 0.9 and have multiple trajectories at 0.93, 0.96, 0.98, and then add it up, you end up with minus 1775.29. And if you do from 0.9 to 1, you end up with 74 points. So there is a difference of about kilocal, right? It's more than a KT. So it depends how close how proximal these I's and J's are, because that's where the more overlaps between the configuration states. and better sampling and better averaging of the delta E in sample delta E. That's the whole idea. Okay. So with this, I'll close this discussion on free energy perturbation method. Next class, I'm going to discuss a little bit of, in fact, I'll spend the hour hopefully talking about thermodynamic integration and slow growth method. And maybe I can connect a little bit with the, because I love the area so much, the Dzarzhinsky, though the convergence is a major issue in Dzarzhinsky's formulation, about the work aspect, the reversible work, the forward backward work, and these equations. So I try to show like how the thermodynamic integration and free energy perturbation methods are special cases of Dzarzhinsky's equality. Okay. And so that is the idea. And what I'm going to do is, for the set of lectures on these aspects like free energy perturbation, thermodynamic integration, slow growth, we'll keep the same example in the interest of time, and also because we can't do so many tutorials, and make half of the class do through free energy perturbation and other half do through thermodynamic integration. Okay. And hopefully that will settle you guys about these two elegant methods nicely, and also take us in good stead when we are doing next. After this, I'll start the histogram based method, umbrella sampling, and the future, like following that we'll do replica exchange and metadynamics, and then maybe I'll go to course learning. Okay, I think I have ample time to make all these. We have a month to cover the lectures, maybe more than a month, because you guys will be coming back in June 1st if things are stable with respect to the contagion spreading, which I'm looking forward to. Okay, so feel free to send me questions, emails, and looking forward. So last week we couldn't do the Zoom, we couldn't do the 101, but I think I'm now going to use Microsoft Team, which is being provided by the Institute, to connect with all of you. Okay, so just wait for email from me about scheduling a discussion. Okay, so let me finish the thermodynamic integration part and the Dzarzhinsky equation, and after that we can have a discussion on this aspect of the lectures that I have talked about. Okay, so that's about it for today, and keep yourself safe, stay at home, do some reading. If you're free, just tell me, I'll send you some papers. Okay, and okay, so talk to you guys soon. Bye.